All right. And thank you for joining us, folks. Proud to be here right now with Zach and Naz, two people who know the esports industry and business better than almost anybody else. And guys, I want to start by making fun of myself, I think, a little bit. Last year, in about first couple of weeks of April 2020, at a previous job, I wrote a story about how a lengthy pandemic could be the accelerant for the esports industry, kind of working under the belief that although live events are obviously important in this industry as well, that the kind of endemic digital nature of esports was really going to set it up well for a time when people are both stuck at home and also traditional sports are maybe not playing as much. I don't think I was exactly right maybe about how that played out, but I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on what the last 18 months have meant for an industry that was growing and growing very quickly up until the pandemic.
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, I saw both sides of that during the pandemic, coming from the traditional sports world and having a foot in esports with Team Liquid and our NBA 2K League team. I will say our 2K League team performed quite well. We won back-to-back trophies in 20 and 2021, playing all remote and then on stage in 21. Team Liquid also played very well, all the while our building was shuttered. We couldn't bring fans into our physical building. I'm calling you today from Capital One Arena. It feels great to be back, and fans have smiles on their faces when they're coming back into the building. We've had sold out houses again. There's nothing that beats it. But I really took that it was a silver lining that, demo of esports, usership of a lot of the platforms really did increase. And we also saw some overlap between the audiences too. The 2K League, for example, struck a deal with ESPN2 and got their championship game broadcasted on that when live sports were shut down. That was a great example where esports, I think, seized on that opportunity. But the larger esports world is also capitalizing on some of the other trends that have exploded during the pandemic, like NFTs and whatnot. Team Liquid, most notably, signed a significant deal with Coinbase. And cryptocurrency had been around prior to the pandemic, of course, but I don't think it had reached the relevancy that I think is sort of the mainstream pop culture way until the last 12 to 18 months. So I think what we took away from the pandemic is that clicks are in, bricks are coming back, but it really does pay to be in the clicks world. All of the FANG stocks were the ones that performed so well during the pandemic. And so we all want to transfer our business into being more clicks, and esports is perfectly positioned to continue to take advantage of that. Whenever we can try to lend some of our best practices from a brick and mortar perspective, we will. But we learn as much from esports as esports learns from traditional sports.
Yeah, I love the way you say that, Zach. We on our side, we live in a pretty much all click world, or click first world. I'll put it that way. We were, interestingly enough, one of the first sports leagues to be impacted by COVID because we operate a pretty big league out in China. So China being first hit, our league was first hit. And I give a lot of credit to our technology teams in our esports division. We were able to very quickly pivot from having a live audience and broadcast teams sitting in our arenas producing the shows, and pro players, of course, competing out of those arenas, to going completely online. And so I think we went offline for a couple weeks in China, quickly came back on to 100% virtual production, and then quickly essentially taught, right? We taught all of our other regions around the world how to do the same, and essentially we're able to get ahead of it. And since 2020, we've been pretty much virtual. And what I mean by that is there were periods of time, of course, we were completely virtual, meaning our pro players were also competing from the safety of their own homes. We've since been able to bring, depending on what region and territory we're talking about, we've been able to bring pro teams and our broadcast and production crews back on site. We've unfortunately not been able to have a live audience in our arenas yet. but we're certainly hopeful that 2022 will be the year that we can bring them back. I don't think anything substitutes or replaces the energy that a live audience can bring. We know our pro teams love to see it. We certainly feed off of it, so we do welcome that. But for us, our sport is viewed by tens of millions of people every event around the world, and so the majority of those viewers are viewing from home. So it's up to us to figure out how to optimize that viewing experience for those masses and not just the folks that are coming into the arenas.
From a financial standpoint, how important are live events to the esports ecosystems that both of you guys operate in? I think a lot of people still think of esports as being digital only, and obviously that's not true. But I'm curious how, from a business standpoint, how important those World Championship events that you guys have hosted and will continue to host, how important those are from kind of the balance sheet standpoint.
There's some revenue there. I would argue that it's definitely not as high as what you see in traditional sports. One, at least for League of Legends, we're not operating in city-based arenas, so that structure isn't there. We do have ticket revenue, but again, compared to traditional sports, a lot lower, less frequent live events. But we certainly make up for that in other areas, right? I think the digital revenue side of esports is the area that's particularly interesting from a revenue generation standpoint. There are other, non-ticket revenue considerations, right? When it comes to live events, sponsorships and on-site activations are certainly something that you do see at esports events. And so we've really pivoted these last 2 years to taking those activations virtual as well, and figuring out, again, with our partners, how can we give you digital real estate to replace kind of the physical real estate that you get from signage, and then how can we find ways for you to engage fans, not just those that are coming to the arenas, but all those that are watching, and that in fact gives those sponsors exponentially larger audiences to engage with than just those that are able to attend a live event.
I find the sponsors, go ahead, Zach.
I was going to say, just to add on to that, it's interesting when you think about the evolution of traditional sports. They started off going really deep, a mile deep on a grassroots level and in a local level. Games weren't even on television for a long time. The NBA's celebrating its 75th anniversary. The NHL is 100 years old. And finally, they grew their presence, and then they built national and then global platforms with global audiences and appeal. Esports didn't develop grassroots communities in geocentric locations. They developed them in chat rooms and different online formats. And then it quickly became a global platform, but it's not a mile deep. And so I've always thought that's something that esports could benefit as sort of the next generation of building team value, building league value, would be figuring out a way to go deeper locally and starting to build local events, whether it just be watch parties or eventually competitions, touring models and the like. And it's the reason why Team Liquid launched Liquid Plus. They wanted to get to know their customer. They don't want just high-level metrics on how many people are watching. They actually want to know who their fans are. They want to be a direct-to-consumer business. And that's something that I think traditional sports has done very well at, and esports has a huge opportunity to grow into in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would imagine that obviously the Wizards and the Capitals have a tremendous database of pretty much every sports fan in some capacity in the DMV area. Team Liquid, I would think, is again a much more global audience base. There's no kind of, at least not right now, any kind of specific geographic to dive into. How do you fix that? I mean, Naz, I also would love to hear your thoughts on that. Also, is there a world in which NALCS franchises are also geographically based, which I know some other parts of the esports ecosystem are trying? How do you kind of build keep the global, but also kind of dive into the regional?
Yeah, I think for us, what you'll see is it'll probably start from the next tier down from a like a competitive structure. And I'll point to Europe is a very good example of what we do there. So the LEC is the equivalent of the LCS. So it's our professional European league there. Beneath the LEC is, you could call it a developmental league. called the European Regional Leagues, and they culminate in a European Masters. What that is really are their national leagues. So there's a French league, there's a German league, there's a Spanish league, et cetera, et cetera. And we see that very local fandom. You know, our French audience is really rooting for those teams. And then when those players, you know, if and when they kind of get poached, right, by those LEC teams, that fandom follows. And so you're starting to see some of that local. It's not city-based for us yet at this time, but I do think as we continue to, you know, if you think of the competitive League of Legends, right, as a pyramid, and the pro players kind of the tip of the pyramid, as we continue to fill out what the rest of that pyramid looks like with, you know, colleges and high schools, then I think you're going to start to really see that local fandom, you know, develop. But I agree with, excuse me, I agree with Zach. I think it's a really interesting area for esports to look into. And on the flip side for us is that our audience is so global. And so in a way, we want to balance this notion of, you know, the audience is so borderless, the fandom's so borderless. So it's almost like, how do we continue to keep those borders down? Because it's incredible to have a North American audience rooting for a European team or a Chinese team or a Korean team and vice versa. That kind of gives our pro teams just this massive audience base to go get. But agree with Zach, you kind of want that balance of, you know, your local fandom and your global heroes.
Zach, I'm curious, when you think about Team Liquid, how do you think about attracting new fans? For some ways, the Wizards and the Capitals, it's fairly easy. You have an area where a lot of people are born and they grow up rooting for the team that they can see on TV and that they can go watch in person. Is it a better content strategy? Is it the players that you're signing? How do you think about the way that a Team Liquid differentiates itself from all the other kind of without region esports brands out there?
I think the lines are getting blurred all over the place, and I think that's good for teams in esports and traditional sports. You know, on the Team Liquid side, I think the reason why they've built a great fan base is not only because they've been successful on the Rift, they've had successful teams, but they've competed across lots of different platforms, lots of different titles. You know, they've got over a dozen teams, and as we know, every title has a very different fan base. You know, a CSGO fan is very different from a League of Legends fan, and they have hotspots in different parts of the world. You know, Rainbow Six, very popular in Brazil, for example, versus, you know, League of Legends or something, for example. So they definitely have different brands and sort of meanings to different geographic regions and different titles. But they are, I think, the common thread is an authenticity, is a level to treating athletes the right way. And I think that has really benefited Team Liquid. You know, on the traditional sports side, sure, yeah, if you're living in Washington, D.C., you're likely to be a Capitals or Wizards fan. But, you know, we have Rui Hachimura playing for the Washington Wizards, and we're probably the most popular NBA team in Japan right now. And so, you know, there are Premier League teams that American fans watch all the time. There are, you know, Manchester United fans in Washington, D.C. And so that's what I mean in terms of blurring the lines. I think there's room for both of those things. But for Team Liquid, I think it's really developing a core thesis around what are our values, and then finding fans that really also embrace those values, winning being one of them.
How do you guys feel like the franchised esports model is working? Naz, I think in 2018 is when Riot Games kind of started along that path. It's a model that seems very clearly to be modeled in some ways after U.S. traditional sports. There's revenue sharing, there's minimum salaries, all of that. There were some diehards within esports communities, obviously, that were a little skeptical, felt like maybe it was kind of getting away from the more decentralized nature that esports had known for a while. But now that we're 3-4 years into the experiment, I'm curious how you feel like it is, how it's working out.
Yeah, you know, we think it's working well. We, like you said, we franchised first the LCS, which is our North America League, back in 2018, fast followed with Europe and, you know, now China, our Korean leagues, our Brazilian league, just at the end of 2020 franchised. So 2021 has been their first season. They're actually the only
franchise sports league, I believe, in Brazil, which is kind of incredible to
Whoa.
think about. Yeah. But, our lesson that we've really learned is that, not every game that we launch, not every region needs or should have a franchise model or kind of a permanent partner structure. For us, it's really, really critical to let the game's audience and the community around that game and that esport develop before we determine what the best long-term structure for a league is. And a great example, right, is that we've launched Valorant Esports, which is our tactical shooter game, and the esport is, surpassing all our expectations this year. It's our inaugural season. But even though we've had success with League on the franchise side, we didn't jump the gun and immediately launch Valorant from a franchise position, again, because we really want the community to develop, and then we can see what structure is gonna make sense. There's certainly pros and cons, to both. Franchise leagues obviously bring a lot of stability for teams, for their sponsors. It opens up the opportunity for teams to really invest, whether that's in infrastructure and players, et cetera, that they might not otherwise feel comfortable doing, understandably, right, without a permanent slot, and kind of knowing that they're going to have that platform and that exposure, season in and season out. And of course, on the other hand, these open ecosystems, they promote a wider variety of teams and organizations and players, frankly, from getting to come in and try and dip their toes. Our fans, we get mixed reactions, admittedly, from fans. Back in the day, some fans didn't want to see the closed system. They liked a promotion relegation system. They wanted to see fresh blood coming in and out of the league. But I think, fans are liking what they're seeing now. Again, they're building strong affinities for these teams, and the brands and teams, Zach can talk about Team Liquid, are doing an incredible job of building those brands and, building the profile of the stars that are on those teams, and really giving fans kind of a reason to love them and to follow the sport.
Yeah, Zach, I'd love to hear your kind of the investor side of that conversation. There's a reason why MLS teams are worth a lot more than English Premier League teams. And the main reason there is that they can't get relegated. There's obviously some stability to this model. I'm curious how you think about, from where you sit, the difference between kind of investing in franchise esports versus some of these other titles and other leagues that are not the same structure.
Well, it certainly feels safer to own a franchise slot, and it's an easier way to build value because there's scarcity. There's only X number of slots available in a league. I think when we think about being members of the leagues that we are in, the NBA and the NHL, for example, or the W, we compete on the court or the ice, but we're partners off it. And there's a lot of best practice sharing, and there's a scale that a league can come and represent on behalf of teams too. And that's where you get the NBA, crafting a great national television partnership with ESPN and Turner and driving national sponsorships while the teams are driving local deals and local media rights deals and whatnot. And so I think we're incredibly happy members of the NALCS, of course. It's probably not the right model for all esports. That's definitely the truth. It should be for the top and most followed esports platforms out there. I think that the NALCS has come, just a long way in terms of driving revenue. It's a really exciting time to be a part of the league. I would love to see more esports franchise. I think it would just add more stability and more organization. But again, it's not for every esport, and that's what keeps it interesting.
Naz, I don't know the breakdown for NALCS, but there are obviously teams that are controlled by groups like Monumental that have a ton of experience in that franchise model universe. There are other teams that still have ownership that kind of dates back to the earlier pre-franchise esports world. How different are your interactions with those groups? Are people telling you, do one set of people want one thing and the other set? I'm just curious if your conversations are different depending on kind of what the background is of the ownership group of your franchises.
Yeah, it's actually an aspect of franchising that we were probably most excited about on our end, which was infusing the league with this expertise and know-how, right, from the traditional sports world. And I think you've seen, you can look at a number of examples across, just the LCS of how the level of sophistication from a team operation standpoint, from how they manage their players, treat their players, et cetera, like that has just continued to elevate and escalate, I think, because of that expertise and knowledge that those ownership groups and investors have brought in. Honestly, for the LCS, and again, it's our North America League, I believe that every one of the 10 teams at this point has a professional sports organization or professional traditional sports athletes on their cap table. But when you look at all these teams, I think the dividing lines, right, among the ownership groups probably just comes from what their business focuses are. You have some teams that are really focused on building their brand. You see them doing these, amazing kind of merch collaborations. Others are focused on content creation. Others are launching ancillary businesses. And so for us, our North America commissioner always says that, when we franchised, we weren't looking for the 10 best partners. We were looking for the group of 10 best partners. And to Zach's point, like how they can all come together and elevate the league, learn from each other, we can learn from them, and vice versa. So we're just really thrilled that all 10 of our teams in the LCS are really committed to growing the league and the fandom. And that's always been the hope and the dream.
One of the things we do at Sportico is valuations for, at least so far, just for the traditional sports side. And Zach, you obviously, you know those numbers very well. NBA teams are appreciating very quickly. NHL teams are as well, maybe not quite as fast. I'm curious what you think about kind of esports, and we can maybe stay specifically in NALCS for the purpose of this discussion. But what do you think you're going to see, let's say 5 or 10 years from now, in terms of the appreciation for NALCS teams relative to NHL or NBA teams in your portfolio?
Well, I mean, when we first invested into Team Liquid, it was only generating $1.5 million. Now they're going to do, north of $50 million. They're driving revenues very quickly, and they are launching additional lines of business like, Naz alluded to. And I think that a lot of these teams are raising capital to potentially pursue M&A opportunities too, because they understand that these teams are platforms. A lot of people call Team Liquid just TL. We call it TLE for Team Liquid Enterprises. And we think there's, great advantage to being part of the Team Liquid platform, just like we have a platform here at Monumental. NBA teams and esports teams actually are valued kind of similarly, in the sense that they're valued on a multiple of revenue. It's typically 10x or higher. And so I think that's a credit to the growth trajectory that, those kind of leagues have. I don't see esports slowing down. Our goal was, we'd like to wake up one day and see Team Liquid be the same size and scale as one of our core properties, to be the same size as a Major 4 league. And when my father purchased the Capitals back in 2001, he purchased the Capitals for around $80 million. The team has appreciated significantly since then. But Team Liquid today is more valuable than the initial purchase price of the Capitals back then. So a lot can change. We think Team Liquid can be $1 billion plus enterprise one day.
How fast do you think that happens? I mean, if I were to tell you that in some year in the future, Team Liquid is worth as much as the Capitals, what year do you think that is?
I mean, I can't say that. You got me stumped there, but I don't think it's a pipe dream to say within a decade.
Interesting. Naz, how much do you think about valuations? Is that something that is hyper relevant in your job? Is it kind of an ancillary benefit of just the regular growth that you guys see on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis?
Yeah, we certainly want to think about ensuring that all the players, and I don't mean the pro players, all the players in our ecosystem, the teams, the pros, have the opportunity to thrive, right? That's the only way the sport can sustain. And we truly believe that this is a multi-generational sport. It's not going anywhere. We're going to be here decades from now. And so, we generally take a long view of building that value. Like, what can we do? What steps can we take to ensure that the ecosystem is in a good place where everybody, really can thrive. I always say that this has been, I'll say, LOL Esports 1.0. And I think that's kind of generation one, right? Even in terms of the audience who's tuning in. And it's going to be really interesting to see as we've gone into now our second decade, which by traditional sports standards does not sound like a long time, but by esports standards is the longest time. But as we do that, new generations are going to come in. I think the barriers to entry to the sport will continue to go down, even, in terms of, for us, we just launched League of Legends on mobile. That starts to make the game that much more accessible to people, and teaches the rules of the game to more. And so essentially my hope and my expectation is that fandom goes up, which is good for everybody, right? It's good for Team Liquid, it's good for the LCS, it's good for our global sport. And I think you're just going to continue to see that as more and more people kind of understand how the game is played, they're going to be able to enjoy the sport more and come into the fold.
What does esports 2.0 look like?
So what I would say is, again, I think it's that next generation. I also think something that's going to be a focus of ours is how do we continue to build on how viewers and fans can experience the sport. I think we've really only started to scratch the surface. And I say we, I mean, as a full industry, not just Riot, but also Riot. When you think about what makes esports, I think, unique compared to traditional sports, it's that we have a built-in direct connection to the audience, right? And so if the NBA could directly connect to everybody who sits down on the couch and turns on a game, and you can start to customize, let's say, the content you serve them, you can reward them, you can engage with them directly, and also understand their consumption habits, that starts to become really interesting. And that's what we actually have in esports. It's obviously a responsibility we take very, very, very seriously, and would want to make sure that we wield it in a way that, again, only serves to amplify how people can experience our sport. But I do think that that's going to be probably kind of the next leap that esports makes as a whole.
Zach, you mentioned NFTs earlier. Certainly one of NFTs and crypto, I would say, is one of the kind of the biggest changes, kind of new additions to the sports and entertainment worlds in the past year or so. I'm curious how you think about, the adoption that you might see among different Monumental properties for things, new technology like that, and whether Team Liquid and Warriors Gaming District are maybe a better place to start with some of those things than traditional sports teams that may have an older demographic that might not be as adaptive or adoptive of those technologies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it probably seemed far-fetched, just a couple of years ago to imagine that there'd be a couple of arenas in the NBA and that'd be named after crypto, platforms. But you got FTX Arena and Crypto.com Arena in Los Angeles now. So it's real, and it's definitely here to stay. I think that, what those companies are realizing is that there's great crossover between sports brands and a crypto audience. They're younger, they're affluent, they're interested in gamification, they're interested in taking some risks, they're interested in following market trends, they're highly educated. And so, esports is a great crossover with that. I think the esports audience is right in that same strike zone. Our leagues obviously have pretty defined frameworks on what teams can do. And I think that those frameworks always evolve over time. And they learn from different experimentations that happen in local markets. And so we pursued a pilot program for the Capitals and Wizards here last year, where we were selling some NFTs, Stanley Cup banners, virtual Stanley Cup championship rings and whatnot. And we had, we saw good adoption. It was a lot of fun. I think we're ready to take the next step. And, the league is going to help guide where that can go. We've obviously seen, huge success with NBA Top Shot. That market's cooled down. But clearly it showed a lot of value from our video rights that hadn't been tapped before. And so I would expect the league and teams to want to continue to double click on that moving forward in the future.
Naz, what is Riot Games looking at from a NFT, from a crypto in the blockchain world? What's kind of on your radar right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because obviously digital goods are not
Endemic.
new to, yes, not new to gaming, certainly not new to gamers. There's this whole notion of open and closed ecosystems, ours being one that's closed, that, are goods that are in the game itself. But we've started to do some work with crypto exchanges from a sponsorship standpoint. So the LCS partners with FTX as an example. We haven't yet officially launched any League or Riot NFTs, but it's a space that we're looking at very closely and kind of assessing if and how we should or could get involved. For us, again, it just really kind of goes back to how do we do this in a way that feels good for the audience and adds value to them and doesn't, negatively detract from, how they want to experience the sport and showcase their fandom. So nothing to comment on NFT wise specifically yet, but something we're looking at.
We only have a few minutes left, but so I'll kind of end it on this, and I don't want to get your thoughts on it. I'm obviously pretty bullish on esports, and we talked earlier about the franchise model and ways in which kind of the esports world kind of shifted a little bit towards the traditional sports world. It seems to me like at some point soon the opposite's going to happen. That the idea of the disenfranchised consumers right now that are Gen Z and millennials and whatever's younger than Gen Z are soon going to become the dominant way that people consume. And in that world, esports becomes the thing that is kind of built directly for those consumption habits, right? So I'm curious if you guys think that at some point soon, and I'm sure there's little examples of this, but when we might start to see the traditional sports leagues really start to make changes that mirror kind of what's happening in esports as opposed to kind of the other way around.
Well, I think all leagues and teams and networks are thinking more and more about streaming these days, going direct to consumer. Mostly it's out of market packages or select national packages now. We'll have to see what happens to the future of local rights in a D2C world, but obviously being D2C is very important to traditional sports. I also think that esports has a layer of authenticity and access to players and talent that traditional sports doesn't totally have. I mean, we see lots of interviews with our players and our athletes across the traditional sports leagues, but you're not seeing a basketball player stream his basketball practice and talk to the audience and take questions and chat and whatnot, right?
We should, by the me definitely say that. I'd love to see that in the future.
A credit to some of our players who have said, I think there are channels for me to express myself personally and have people get to understand my brand, and fans really rally around that, right? That's the content that fans really embrace and enjoy the most. And esports has nailed that kind of from the start. It's not cliched, and it's just highly accessible. And so I think we will see a trend back to seeing a lot of our players wanting to brand build and make themselves more accessible to fan bases.
I mean, I could not agree more. I think those are excellent points. I think you're starting to see, a point to the Manning's broadcast, right, of NFL games. That's
good example.
That's like, yeah, right. That's like co-streaming, and you see that being done in esports for many, many years, streaming in general, right? And so I think to your point, Eben, where for so long esports has been taking learnings from the traditional sports space. I don't know if that ever stops, but I think it's esports, it's so technologically advanced and it's reaching this younger and younger demographic so effectively that traditional sports are going to start to look at esports for those learnings. We like to say that we are the future of sports. I stand by that firmly. And so, yeah, we'll see what happens.
Well, as that continues, I will continue to look to both of you to help me understand those changes. Naz, Zach, thank you very much for joining us. This was fun.
Thanks, Eben.
Thank you.